Hello, we're here on the chancel of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Berkeley, a space that's partially dedicated to making music and sound. Out of the camera range, there's a lovely harpsichord over there and a wonderful grand piano, obviously the organ pipes here behind me. Many years ago, when my kids were nursery school age and went to the nursery school attached to the church, I loved to bring those nursery school classes over and introduce them to the kinds of sounds this organ could make, from the teeniest, weeniest little sounds, the pipes are up there, to the great big bass sounds and everything in between. Well, that was years ago, and that experience, I think, contributed to my being asked to give this talk originally for the analyst members of the San Francisco Jung Institute at a dinner meeting. So what I think these days, when I think about music, I think of it as the river that really runs through my life, beginning in utero, and you may see an image on the screen of a river at its fullest and maybe at its source. At this considerably downstream time in my life, when I talk about music, I find I have to include a segment on hearing, which is fundamental to how we listen. And specifically, I'll be talking about loss of hearing. So first, some comments on sound and hearing, and then we'll move into music and healing. Going back upstream now, biologically, and here you'll see an image of a fetus and the ear, we're immersed in sound from the moment of conception. The mother's heartbeat, her digestive sounds, the melodic inflections of her voice, and other internal rhythms and tones and harmony. At a very early stage in utero, our hearing is fully functional for hearing these sounds because sound is very well transmitted into the intrauterine environment, and the inner ear is the only sense organ to reach full adult size and differentiation by fetal midterm. Which leads me to be wondering, could it be that hearing may be our most fundamental sense, the most fundamental of our senses? The neurologist Oliver Sacks once said, "It's infinitely more serious to be born deaf than it is to be born blind." Think attachment, think object relations. You'll see now on the screen an image of a fetus moving. We could say that in utero, in this environment, we have rhythm, melody, harmony, and timbre. Timbre is tone color. It's a French word, T-I-M-B-R-E, for tone color, which means the unique sound that any instrument makes depending on how it's built and how it vibrates. These four, rhythm, harmony, melody, and timbre, are generally to be considered the four basic elements of music, and essentially we're floating in them from the very beginning. For me, my mother's singing must have been among my earliest intrauterine experiences and is probably my greatest gift from her. She was a classically trained lyric soprano, always the paid soloist in the various choirs and in the towns and cities where we lived, and also in oratorios that were presented by the community. Here's an old newspaper ad I found showing her as the soprano soloist in a community presentation of Messiah. This was sometimes a source of pride because no one else's mother could do this, or embarrassment because how do you fit in when nobody else or their mother really cares about this kind of music, much less how to sing it. We also know that by 24 weeks, and here you see a fetus at age 24 weeks, the fetus will startle and turn its head in direction of the sounds external to the mother, which could suggest that I was also experiencing the music of my father, who played the saxophone quite well. In fact, in college, he had played with a guy, it was in a small group with a guy, who later became known professionally as Spike Jones. For those of you who don't know who Spike Jones was, he was a guy who, with his City Slickers, did the most wacky satires on all kinds of music.
Oh, what's he like to be given the right to be carefree and gay once again? No longer slinking, respectably drinking like civilized ladies and men. No longer need we miss
a charming scene like this. In some secluded rendezvous that overlooks the avenue, with someone sharing a delightful chat, this and that, and cocktails for two, as we enjoy a cigarette to some exquisite chansonette. Two hands are sure to slyly meet beneath a serviette with cocktails for two.
My father also played piano by ear, although sometimes with excruciatingly incorrect chord progressions. This was something my mother and I could agree on. Later in his life, my father organized a small instrumental group that played big band songs and other music of an earlier era, and my mother sometimes sang with them, as this photo shows. That's my father on the right, my mother singing. So in my life, there were some real opposites in music from the very beginning. After birth, we learn the mother's voice before we learn her scent. And we make our own sounds and tones, and caregivers respond to them in emotionally significant ways, and attachments are formed. Now listen to this dialogue with a 1-month-old baby and her mom, his mom, talking in the background.
What? Yeah? What? You're so cute. What's up, honey?
These infant sounds go on to develop into 3 forms of adult vocalized sound: speech, music, and what are sometimes called paralingual utterances. Those are the things that have no pitch, like laughs and shrieks and groans. In fact, the words person and persona come from the Latin per sona, through sound. We are known through the sounds we make. For me, these musical sounds have been primarily through voice and singing. Singing, I've been in choruses my entire life. Here are a couple shots of choruses. School, church, one of these is a symphony chorus, one is the San Francisco Bach Choir, also Berkshire Choral International. Being inside the music in this way, in the way you are when you're actually performing, is an experience that can be talked around and about, but never described fully in words. I've also done a lot of accompanying of choruses and soloists on both the piano and on the organ, because I was a church organist here for some time. For 5 years, I was also a community orchestra manager. Here's an image of a community orchestra playing outside. Note they have clothespins on their music stands to hold the music down. It's a really fine thing to know that the orchestra that's on stage, and actually was on this very stage, giving this concert, is there because you got them together. And the conductor is getting them to perform this great music. And it gave me considerable education about the whole gestalt of orchestras, characteristics of players and conductors and musical instruments, and the orchestral repertoire, all of which has stood me in very good stead. And finally, I have to include my writing and speaking on the topic of psyche and music, as witness this talk. Now we'll see a picture of an old Steinway upright grand piano. This was built in 1908. It's the piano that was in my grandparents' home and my parents' home, and is the piano that I learned on. It's now in my home. When my late husband and I were married, the one position neither of us could give up was our pianos. So we had 2 pianos and an antique pump organ, which you see here, which my parents had found in a garage covered with pigeon droppings, bought for $9 and restored. When I downsized a few years ago, the day the movers brought my piano and my organ to the home, my new home, I really had tears. It was as though something of my essence was arriving. Beyond biology now, There are creation myths worldwide suggesting that the origin of the music is in sound, sorry, the origin of the world is in sound or music. Here are a few examples. Here you see on the screen an image of the song lines of Australia. It's said that the song lines of Australia were created by legendary totemic beings who wandered about the continent singing out the names of things that they saw, tree, river, mountain, and so forth. The idea was that they were singing the world into existence, and that Australia could be read as a musical score. So if you knew the score, you could find your way around the country. Closer to home now, the biblical creation myth suggests that sound came first, and God said. The voice of the creative force precedes the light. And here's a picture that I think nicely illustrates that. Another image, Nada Brahma. This is the Sanskrit phrase, in which is very important in Sanskrit and in Indian spirituality. Two of its meanings are God, or the universe is sound, God is sound, and the universe is sound. Maybe you can think of other such creation myths. Now we're going to move into research in several fields. Astrobiology, astronomy, physics, acoustics, and music theory is discovering that there's some truth to these old myths. Maybe we could have the image of the cosmos about here. Two physicists actually got the Nobel Prize for proving that the Big Bang was an actual event, although some 30 to 50% of Americans don't believe that's true. But we now know that everything, even the stars, emit natural vibrations. And here are 3 star sounds. They're by synthesizer based on the vibrations produced by these stars. But there is now evidence that the stars actually produce sound. Hard to imagine because we can't hear in space, but that is the evidence I've read recently. The whole Milky Way vibrates, and there is one tone that underlies the whole universe, which is a B flat, some 57 octaves below what we know as middle C, that middle note on the piano. It's 1,000,000 billion times lower than human hearing. This all suggests that reverberation and vibration and sound, which are different, are really fundamental to existence itself. It's kind of amazing that our world is emerging into an ever-growing self-knowledge about these things. And it seems to me that just as the sounds in the fetal environment affect the fetus, so it seems to me these sounds of the universe must affect all of us all the time, even though they're beyond our conscious hearing. So it's no wonder, and it is truly wonderful, that sound and music can be so fundamental and transformative. Here I'd like to also acknowledge that music is used for other purposes. This is the whole part of the shadow side of music. Think about commercials. For example, there's a breakfast cereal, very well known, the commercial for which used to introduce a children's program on Saturday morning radio when I was little, maybe about 5 or 6. And I could still sing you word for word and note for note that jingle, which I won't do, even though I have never liked the cereal, but the jingle seems to have gotten lodged in my brain. Music has been used to rouse armies to battle. Think of bugle calls and fife and drum corps. And somehow organ music in some parts of popular culture has gotten identified with things that are ominous and scary, which is too bad because the organ is such a noble instrument with such a wonderful repertoire. But for example, Bach's Toccata and Fugue, which is familiar to many people, has been used in at least 24 scary films to enhance the fear. And here's just the opening of the toccata and fugue with the image of Bach's original score. And it would be interesting to do a study of national anthems, which are generally a march or a hymn. But are they celebrating battle? Are they in praise of the country or the monarch or the dynasty or just what? It would be interesting to know. Here, let's segue briefly into the loss of hearing, which can and does affect listening to music. Sound gets distorted. And I wonder how many of you who are watching this are hard of hearing yourselves. I think some people were not there for the original dinner meeting because as hearing loss progresses, it gets increasingly difficult to hear across a table, whether at a dinner meeting or out in a restaurant. You just can't hear. It may sound a little bit like this when you hear the sound and you hear instructions, but you really can't tell what's being said. Which brings us to hearing aids. They're great as far as they go. I wouldn't want to be without mine. However, though a device may be quite good and quite expensive and have controls for volume and reducing background noise, it simply cannot begin to provide what natural hearing is really like. Although I understand this is being worked on. You'll see images for hard of hearing going throughout this section. My late husband was profoundly hard of hearing in one ear and had very limited hearing in the other. That's when I really became aware of the problem that hearing loss is. For example, we were walking one day and his keys fell out of his pocket, a chunk of keys fell out of his pocket. He didn't hear them hit the pavement. I did. That's when I thought, whoa, this is really a disability. Now, with my own hearing loss, I'm having some of the same experiences and frustrations that he did. When we first were together, he, who was a trained actor, thought that if I just learned how to speak correctly, he wouldn't have to wear his hearing aid all the time. His audiologist intervened, basically, and said, you wear that hearing aid or you're not going to have a marriage. But the reality is both are true. He did have to wear the hearing aid, and I did have to learn how best to speak to somebody who's hearing impaired. So I consulted a speech pathologist. Normally, my speaking voice is kind of way back in my throat. It doesn't project well. And in our profession, we also have our office voices, which tend to be quiet and don't work in most public situations like dinner meetings or restaurants. And they don't work with the hearing impaired. So what I learned is I have to use the same kind of voice placement as when I sing. And you can do this too, even if you're not a singer. As singers, we can't see the vocal mechanism, so we use a lot of imagery to get the correct voice placement. So you'll hear choir directors and voice teachers say, bring the sound up to the mask of your face, or send it out through your snorkel goggles, or send it out through your eyes or the top of your head. So, and you really can bring your voice up to that place, which I've now done, and maybe you can hear that. So that's the first lesson. Use your voice correctly, especially if it normally doesn't project well. You don't necessarily have to speak all that much louder, but use your voice correctly. Now, a partial laundry list of things to be aware of in speaking with the hearing impaired, some other things. It's difficult, if not impossible, to hear if the speaker is at your side, think taking walks or being in a car, or behind you, or God forbid, in another room. There's a wonderful button here, which you may see on the screen, that says face me when speaking to me. Because we read lips more than we know, so articulate. Articulate, use your lips. Many of us don't. I know people who speak like this, and it's very, very hard to hear what they're saying. You can, but if you use your lips, it's much easier for people to tell. I was at a meeting once of a bunch of analysts. We were sitting in a circle, and one person, every time he said something, put his hand in front of his mouth, which made it quite difficult for some of us. Words of one syllable can be very difficult. More than one syllable gives you a context within which to understand what the word really is. Think about streets: B Street, C Street, D Street, E Street, G Street. Unless you hear the opening consonant, which you don't always, it can be very hard to know what street you're heading for. Or the example I most like to use, I was in a choir rehearsal one day, didn't really know the people on either side of me, and the woman on my right came in, and what I heard her say was, "I forgot to get pork chops." And I knew that couldn't be quite right, so I said, "Excuse me? I forgot to get cough drops." Words of one syllable. Dropped phrases are the next thing. Often when you're making a point and you're leading up to the most crucial point and you get right there and then you drop your voice. And it's very hard for the hearing impaired. Happens with people in normal conversation, happens on the stage, happens in films. Very difficult. Microphones and speaker systems. Speaking into a stationary mic, you have to just stay right there as close as possible. I remember one of our members saying you almost have to make love to it. Or if it's a handheld mic, I've seen people, more people than I could count, get the handheld mic right here. Now can everybody hear me? Good, then I'll go ahead and give my talk, and the microphone's out here somewhere and you don't hear what they're saying. Loudspeakers are especially hard. Speakers in your ear or freestanding. Think especially announcements in airports, on airplanes. They're almost impossible. They come without warning. They're very loud to the point of distortion. Often people speak very rapidly. I always had to repeat them for my husband, and now I get it. It's really hard. Music and speech get really distorted through speakers, especially if the speakers emphasize the bass. Also, answering machines can be difficult. So if you're leaving a message for somebody who you know has some hearing problems, try to speak a little more slowly and clearly. And if you're buying an answering machine, check out the sound of it before you buy it. When there's background noise with hearing aids, you can mechanically screen out some of it. If I want to hear the speaker over there, I can arrange to do that. But if I turn up the volume so that I can hear the speaker better, and then somebody next to me rattles a piece of paper, that's what gets amplified in my ear. Closer to home, when we can't hear our patients or they can't hear us, it becomes an ethical issue. I know at least one patient who stopped working with a therapist because the therapist couldn't understand the patient physiologically was unable to hear him. And refused to modify his speech. You could say, well, raise your hand if you can't hear, but people with hearing loss really get weary of saying what all the time, because if they did so as often as necessary, the interruptions would be more constant than you could possibly imagine. Misunderstandings can be funny, like the cough drops, pork chops one, or they can be a little dicey. We were changing planes one time, and we had a habit of one person would go for a walk while the other stayed with the suitcases. So we agreed on 45 minutes. What he didn't understand when he went out for his walk was that the plane was leaving in 45 minutes. And so he sauntered back in 45 minutes, and the doors were about to close, and he thought, oh, are we leaving early? Well, no, we hadn't made it clear. So I learned to anticipate what my husband could not hear and automatically translate for him. Otherwise, hearing loss can be so very isolating. The good thing is that they're good enough hearing devices, but do know when you make the special effort that it really takes to talk to somebody who's really hearing impaired, you'll be appreciated more than you can imagine. Now let's turn to music. And here I have to note, there's a bird in this building, and you can hear it chirping, and it's getting closer and closer. I think it wants to be included since we're talking about music. We turn to music consciously or unconsciously. It can express what's not yet conscious. The first thing I think of is the old movie Singing in the Rain, and you see on the screen Gene Kelly doing his dancing and singing in the rain. We are happy and we may whistle or sing aloud or in the shower or walking down the street. I know one person who has a bumper sticker on her back of her car that says, "Caution, driver may be singing." We're sad and we sing the blues. At death, music can comfort, console, it can help release emotions. We use it at ceremonial events. You all know the traditional wedding march, which was, by the way, played for a wedding that didn't do so well. The marriage didn't do so well. And the traditional graduation march. We use music at funerals. We use it places like ball games, ba-da-dum, ba-dum, kind of rouse to action. And important life circumstances. Here you'll see on the screen the slave songs of the United States. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Or on the other end of that movement, the civil rights movement. You all know We Shall Overcome. On the first anniversary of 9/11, there was a musical event that circled the globe, literally. It started when the Seattle Symphony, shortly after 9/11, was performing the Mozart Requiem. And afterwards, a patron met one of the singers, just sort of by chance, it was said, and said, while you were singing, I had the image of Ground Zero with a chorus all around it and singing the Mozart Requiem. Well, that couldn't happen, but the singer took it back to the chorus and they put the word out. And so all around the world on 7 continents in, I don't know how many countries, but over 200, maybe through 250 choirs, all on the first anniversary of 9/11 at 8:46 in the morning, the time when the first plane hit the first of the Twin Towers, began singing the Mozart Requiem. So for 24 hours, that music circled the globe. It's very moving. I was a part of one of those performances, and you could go if you didn't sing at all, to listen, or any singer could go and participate. At the door, they handed us a name tag, at least where I was, and I presume all over. On the name tag were 2 images, the heart and the world, and not my name, but the name of somebody who had died in one of those attacks. It was a very moving way in which to sing the Mozart Requiem. In a similar vein, but much more contained, there is what is now known as the Defiant Requiem. This was prisoners at Terezin concentration camp outside of Prague, learned by rote from a single 144-page score, the Verdi Requiem, which is one of the high points of the repertoire. It's a huge piece. They learned it by rote, sang it from memory 16 times in the last 2 years of World War II as an act of defiance and resistance, showing that it's possible to respond to the worst of humanity with the best of humanity. And here you'll see some of the images from that time on the screen. This is the actual choir in a rehearsal. Or the very simple, unexpected experience I had. We were taking a 6 o'clock flight from Boston to San Francisco one time, and you have to get the 4 o'clock shuttle. And you know how you are, at least how I am at 4 o'clock in the morning. So when the shuttle driver showed up and took my bag, I said, "Well, I'm glad you're here." And he said, "Well, I'm glad I'm here too." And I thought, really? But we got on the shuttle and sat down, and the lights went out for about the 15-minute trip to the airport. And all of a sudden, there was this beautiful baritone voice serenading us with lovely old ballads.
Dure qu'un mot.
Just a wonderful voice. Well, we looked at each other, our foreheads dropped, our shoulders dropped, our bodies relaxed, and we stayed that way to the airport and all the way home, and maybe to some extent even now. Jung once said, enchantment like that is the oldest form of medicine. He was referring to the power of music to heal and to be transformative. And by the way, there are 2 recorded incidences of Jung using music with patients, singing actually, and they worked. Rabbi Abraham Heschel said something similar, and here you'll see this on the screen. The wave of song carries the soul to such heights which utterable meanings can never reach. Such abandonment is not escape, but a return to one's origins. So I'm going to share with you some of my experiences with and about music, which is what I was asked to do, and hope that they will lead you to think about your own experiences. Since the analytic training was common to all of us at that first talk, and probably now too, I'll first include a couple of experiences that happened during that time. First, my admissions application included experiences in relationship to music. One, that I work with music clinically in my practice. That my PhD dissertation had been a cross-cultural study of responses in imagery and affect to Chinese classical and Western classical music. And here you see an image of the cover of that bit of work. It included the idea that the role of the analyst or therapist is very comparable to the role of an accompanist in music. And here you see images of that. Supporting, countering, mirroring, sometimes leading, following, amplifying, but always trying to be in sync with the soloist or the patient. It's an art form in itself, either way. And these days, there are actually degrees in what's called collaborative piano, that is, accompanying, playing chamber music, and so forth. I entered the training in 1989, and the group with which I entered immediately fell into what proved to be an irreconcilable split. It was really hell. And it was compounded by the fact that the Institute itself suddenly plunged into a very dark time in its own history, having nothing to do with our group at all, but certainly impacting it. So within that sort of gloomy and depressive atmosphere, in the first 2 months of the training, my 23-year-old daughter was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease. Now that's a whole other story, but I bring it in here because I have a musical point. In the depths of depression and anxiety, I'd gone to lunch with a dear friend and confidant, and we were standing in a local bookstore, Shambhala, in Berkeley. And as I recall, I was kind of standing there rather numbly when I suddenly became aware that there was music playing. It was not only any music, it was a piece that I consider to be one of the most beautiful ever written, the second movement of Bach's Double Violin Concerto. And we'll take a moment here so you can hear at least the first minute of that. And I encourage you to go listen to the whole thing on your own. For me, Bach is solid to the core of the earth, that deep. That's when the thought first came into my mind, oh, there's still music. And that's been bedrock ever since. In really tough situations, there is still music. If I lose what's most dear to me, there is still music. as rock, center, guide, consolation, mirror, companion, and so much more. It's just one example of how music informs and provides healing. Of course, we still had to go through the hell of her chemotherapy and radiation treatments, each in our own way, facing all the possibilities, including death, because any powerful medicine can be very dangerous. And for me, the question, okay, should I really remain in the training? Is that what I'm meant to do here? My psyche never gave me a clear message to drop out, so I didn't. My daughter recovered, and now some 28 years later is a successful practitioner of Chinese medicine, and I still worry about her health. But concurrent with her diagnosis, literally to the day, was the huge sound of the October 17th Loma Prieta earthquake. And here's an image that you all remember from that time. If you don't live in earthquake country, you may not realize that often sound comes with them. Sometimes it could be a big bang. In the case of Loma Prieta, it was a roar from whole buildings swaying and rocks sliding past each other. It was quite impressive. Sometime after that, driving home from the Institute in San Francisco to my home, which was then in the East Bay, and driving through Marin County because, of course, the Bay Bridge was down. And it was after a particularly difficult group meeting at the Institute. I was ruminating and found the thought coming to my mind, well, they can't take music away from me. So imagine my response when, in a joint review meeting on Pearl Harbor Day, which proved to be an apt metaphor for what happened in that meeting, as you can see by these images of Pearl Harbor, was after the second year of training hell, one analyst said rather dismissively and disdainfully, music is just a defense. It is the single worst thing ever said to me in the course of the training, especially since no one had ever asked about my relationship with music, much less how I use it professionally. Much later at a conference, I talked with the person who had said it, who really apologized very sincerely, and we felt resolved with each other. At the time, though, I was way too hurt and shocked to even try to begin to formulate a response. Although one of my friends, when I told her about the comment, said, well, that's just ignorant, and that helped. But at the time, in my general devastation, I went home and pondered again, am I supposed to really be in this training? Should I stay here? At some point, I began to read Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, and that's when I really began to take more note of the comments and references to Jung's relationship to music, which are mostly unindexed. And that led to a continuation and expansion of my work on music and psyche, which is continuing even today. But one more experience in the training, the final one. I was lying awake far too early one morning in the spring of 1997. It was just 6 weeks before I was to meet with the certifying board. You may have your own experience of this. But it was also just 9 days after the death of one of my control analysts, Don Sander, who died suddenly and unexpectedly. His death would have been a blow at any time, but this timing was beyond belief. In those 9 days, I'd been feeling disoriented, like I was unable to find magnetic north. It felt like a gigantic redwood had fallen, leaving a gaping hole in me. So I was depressed, fearful, tearful, unsettled, and also in some way contemplating. And that's when I became aware that way back in the far reaches of my mind, there was music playing. Well, now that's not unusual for me. I often have music in my mind, but now seemed particularly interesting. So I tuned in, and I knew instantly what it was. It was the great mezzo-soprano Jenny Turrell singing Mahler, with Leonard Bernstein conducting. My favorite recording of Bernstein's Symphony No. 2, which was recorded in 1963. I get moved when I talk about it. I knew it very well. I performed in it because the last movement is a choral movement. I love it, but I hadn't thought about it in some time. So I want you now to hear the first couple minutes of what Jenny Turrell was singing. So why this movement, this symphony, and why now? That's always the question to ask when music comes to your mind spontaneously. Why this music? Why now? This movement of the Mahler second is called Urlicht, which means primal or primordial light. It speaks of being in great pain and great need and longing for release and longing for the eternal light, the primeval light. It comes just before the final triumphant movement, which gives the whole symphony its subtitle, Resurrection, and that fact was not lost on me either. For me, hearing a small part of a work implies connection with the whole of it, and I would just as soon stop right now and we would listen to the whole 80 minutes of the Mahler second, but we're not going to do that. I do suggest you go home and do so, though. So for the next 6 weeks, until the certifying board meeting, my constant companion in the car was Mahler 2. It started and stopped whenever the car did, and I was doing a lot of driving in those days. I simply went with it, wherever it was. Mahler 2 covers the whole gamut of emotions, and in that process, it became a metaphor not only for my journey through the training program, but through life itself. During that time, I had all kinds of wonderful support. I don't know that anyone except maybe my husband knew that I was listening to the Mahler and how I was listening to it. The music literally infused me with doses of strength and perspective, and is at least as responsible for getting me through that final meeting as any of the other work I was doing at that time. So we will pause now and we'll hear about 4.5 minutes, the final 4.5 minutes of the whole symphony. The words are Auferstehen, which means rise again, and I'm going to cry again, it's okay. Rise again, with wings I have rested for myself. So we'll take a pause and listen to that music now. It's almost a shame to introduce any spoken words after that glorious music, however, we will go on. We're now going to be talking a little bit about Freud and Jung, and here's a picture of the two of them together. Each of them had a reputation for disliking music. It's not true, but there's plenty of reason for the reputation. Freud is quoted as saying he was almost incapable of obtaining any pleasure from music, although at least twice Reich observed him enjoying music. He rarely went to opera, and when he did, it was usually Mozart. He detested the music of Wagner, although he loved Wagner's opera Die Meistersinger, and said about it, as in no other opera, real ideas are set to music, with tones of feeling attached to it, lingering on as one reflects on them. So he's reflecting on it. Kohut claims Freud consciously avoided music, not letting himself be moved by something he literally couldn't stand and couldn't explain, meaning really what he couldn't explain, and that to his credit, Freud saw it as a price he paid for his logical, rational way of being. He simply dismissed what he considered not rational. There's a supporting anecdote. Freud's son is said to have returned one night from a concert in Vienna and said to his father, "I'd like to study the piano." And Freud is said to have gone into a minor rampage, pounding his fist on the furniture and saying, "Absolutely not. I've seen what music has done to some of my patients. I just will not have music in the house. Forget it." Now, this is especially interesting in light of the fact that Freud treated at least two great musicians, composer-conductor Gustav Mahler and conductor Bruno Walter. One wonders how that really worked, given what the nature of the countertransference must have been. Peter Ostwald concludes that apparently one treatment for Walter included simply trying to distract him from his musical activity. It, of course, failed. A later approach might have been a little more successful, but was never curative. Here's an image of Gustav Mahler and Bruno Walter together. Now, all the biographers who actually knew Jung refer to his relationship with music. He loved old spirituals from the American South. He loved old army songs. And interesting, he loved especially Bach, having repeatedly listened to Bach's monumental work, Art of the Fugue, and saying he thought it could tell him more about the nature of music than any other piece that he knew of. Listen to what he says here. He says, "I have nothing against music at the proper time and place, but when they turned on the radio in the restaurant, I got so exasperated I pulled out the plug. Jazz and all that stuff is silly and stultifying." He detested modern music and modern art. "But it is even worse when they play classics in such a place. Bach, for instance. Bach talks to God. I am gripped by Bach, but I could slay a man who plays Bach in banal surroundings." This is not a man who doesn't like music. Here you see images of Bach, the man, the organist, that's his score, and after that, Jung's home, because a woman named Margaret Tilley visited him there once. Margaret Tilley was a music therapist for kids at Langley Porter Institute here in San Francisco. She was also a concert pianist. She was well known to members of this institute in an earlier generation, just before my generation. I wish I had known her. There is one tape in the APC library of her talking about what she did, but she didn't play the piano, which is too bad. Anyway, she had been encouraged to visit Jung and by people here. And when she was in Europe on a concert tour, she plucked up her courage and wrote to him, and he said, "Yes, please come to my home." And here's how she describes it. He said, Jung said, "I have read and heard a great deal about music therapy, and it always seemed to me so sentimental and superficial that I was not interested. But these papers of yours are entirely different, and I simply cannot wait to hear what you do. I can't imagine what it is." You can find Margaret Tilley's papers in the literature in the library under psychology and music. And Jung says, "You must please use your language, not mine." She didn't quite understand that, and she says, "Well, but before I do that, Dr. Jung, could I ask what your own relationship to music has been?" And finally somebody asks him. His reply was a surprise. My mother was a fine singer, so was her sister, and my daughter is a fine pianist. I know the whole literature, I've heard everything and all the great performances, but I never listen to music anymore. It exhausts and irritates me. She says, why? And he says, because music is dealing with such deep archetypal material, and those who play don't realize this. And then she understood he cared too much, not too little. And that's true. You can go to a performance and be utterly unmoved by it. Partly it's you, but it may be that the whatever's playing and singing is not connected with the depths of the music at that time. So Margaret Tilley and Jung were joined at Jung's request by Ruth Bailey, who was his secretary, and by Jung's daughter, who I found out from another source was his daughter Mariana, the pianist. After tea, Jung requested that Tilley begin to demonstrate her work, again using her own language. And she said, do you mean you want me to play for you? There was a grand piano in the Jung home, which his daughter played. He said, yes, I want you to treat me exactly as though I were one of your patients. Now, what do you think I need? So they enjoyed that together. And she sat down on the piano bench, and he sat next to her because he too was hard of hearing. And she starts to play, and she says, when I turned around, he was obviously very moved, and he said, go on, go on. And I played again. The second time, he was far more deeply moved, saying, I don't know what is happening to me. What are you doing? And they started to talk. And he would fire question after question at her, in such and such a case. What would you do? What would you expect to happen with that? And they talked for about 2 hours on case material. And he gradually began to, he said, I begin to see what you are doing. Show me more. And so they went on more. And finally, he burst out with this quote, which many of us who like music and our analysts love. This opens up whole new avenues of research I've never even dreamed of. Not just what you've said, but what I have actually felt and experienced. I feel that from now on, music should be an essential part of every analysis. This reaches the deep archetypal material that we can only sometimes reach in our analytic work with patients. This is most remarkable. Well, even if Tilley, and I wish I had a picture of you to show you, but I can't find one. Even if Tilley has overstated it, and I don't think she has, Alan Watts, in his autobiography, actually refers to this meeting. And he says shortly afterward, Jung's daughter said to Margaret, perhaps you don't realize that you did something very important for me and my father. I have always loved music, and he has never understood it. Even his own daughter doesn't understand. And this was a barrier between us. Your coming has changed all that, and I don't know how to thank you. So you can see how the legend developed about both Jung and Freud, but in digging deeper, really everything I've found suggests that both of them were so sensitive probably to the magnitude of the musical experience that it was literally hard to bear, and that got misinterpreted as dislike. Jung did speak about what he called melodic automisms, or Reich called it the haunting melody. That's when music comes to mind spontaneously and you just can't get it out of your head. They seem to think it had to do something about the rhythm of the music, or maybe preventing a complex from being dealt with psychologically, and therefore undesirable that it came to your head. But frankly, I wouldn't want music to stop coming to my mind. It may have to do with the rhythm of the piece, but it could have to do with the melody, harmony, or timbre, or it could have to do with the words. It may be a piece I'm working on, but then why that part of it? It might inform me of how I'm feeling. I'm very interested in one of Edward Whitmont's books. In the introduction, he says, whenever I want to know how I'm feeling, I go to the piano and play. It may be an amplification or confirmation of an idea. I was sitting one day reading about the heartbeat, and you know how it's always printed lub-dub, 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 and I was kind of saying that along in my head when this melody popped into my head, and I ran for the CD that I knew it was on. It's an old Ethiopian lullaby, and it's very short. You're going to hear the whole thing, and in it, the singer is comforting the baby and saying, your mother will soon return with bread and milk. I thought, bread and milk and the human heartbeat. How much more fundamental could you get? So here's that little lullaby.
ሽሩሩሩሩ እሽሩሩሩሩ የቢኒ የናት ቶሎ ነይለት ዳቦውን ባህያ ወተቱን በጉያ ይዘሽለት ነይ ይዘሽለት ነይ እሽሩሩሩሩ እሽሩሩሩሩ ስፈጭ ማዝዬ ስጋግር አዝዬ ስሰራ ማዝዬ ስሄድ ማዝዬ የኔማ ቢንዬ ውረድ ከጀርባዬ።
Music can be a guide through a life experience, as was the Bach when my daughter was diagnosed. Or it can actually have to do with a clinical situation. Years ago, another candidate and I, she was also a musician, went to see a French film called Tous les Matins du Monde. And we went to see it because the newspaper review said this is the best film about music since Amadeus, so that sounded good. Well, it was a very good film. There was some very nice music in it, wonderful music in it. But the plot was that the man's wife had died, actually committed suicide, and he, in his grief, retreated to his cabin in the woods to play his viola da gamba to move through his grief. That would help him through his grief. Well, normally I have a pretty good recall of music. I can pull it back almost on command. But this time we saw that film on a Friday night. I tried all weekend to get a particular piece of that music back into my head and just could not. Until I was sitting with a patient in my 6:30 hour on a Monday and the following Monday evening. She was a high-functioning woman. I would describe her very professional and had grown up in a situation that I would describe as want in the midst of plenty. And she was talking about another of her childhood experiences when all of a sudden the music that I had not been able to recall came roaring back into my head, full volume. The point where I almost thought irrationally, God, can she hear it too? But of course she went on talking, not knowing the struggle that was going on in me to contend with this very loud music in my head. And so we finished the hour and went on and so forth. And what I made of that was that music came back at that very moment to tell me that this woman sitting in front of me had felt as neglected as I thought those little girls had been in the film. So it was really an incredible gift, and you'll hear now the music that was. So back to some theory. Here's a picture of Heinz Kohut. He wrote a few knowledgeable papers about music, relating it to the concepts of id, ego, and superego, and to the various levels of the psyche. And it's clear from how he writes that he really knows the territory of music. I understood from one of our earlier analysts who knew more about Kohut than I did, that Kohut's father was a frustrated concert pianist, so there must have been music around his house when he was growing up. He certainly writes like he knows the territory. His work is all fine, and clinical experience validates it. But I think none of it really accounts for the universal impact of music. Why can music have the power to be so moving and healing, even across cultures? For example, why were the Pygmies so moved that when they first heard Mozart, they wept? Or perhaps, why were you so moved, as most people are, when you heard that little Ethiopian lullaby? Or on quite a different level, during my doctoral research, why was there so much imagery and affect when I played carefully programmed selections of music from the repertoires of Western classical and Chinese classical music for subjects here and in Taiwan? They heard the music of their own culture first and then transitioned to the music of the other culture. None of the people had ever heard the music before or had lived in the other culture, and some of the responses in Taiwan were even being processed through a translator. On the personal level, the responses were each as unique as a thumbprint. The cultural unconscious was evidenced in imagery of both sets of respondents, ancient Chinese court scenes, American Indians. The transitions to the music of the other culture were very interesting. As the Chinese began to cope with Western music, they often had initial images of darkness, but then responses of European imagery, which was not surprising since most of the Western music I chose came from Western Europe. However, the respondents from the US had considerable difficulty making the transition to Chinese music, not in their affect, but in their imagery. Despite the fact they had been told they would be hearing Chinese music, their imagery showed during the Chinese music absolutely nothing Chinese. Instead, there was an astonishing array of other cultures, from the Bowery to the Ukraine to the Mediterranean to Spain to you name it, but no Chinese images. So you can see some implications for cross-cultural work here. However, at the deepest level, the archetypal, there was a depth of similarity of responses, both of imagery and affect, and I'll just give you two examples. One of the Western pieces I used was the third movement of Brahms' First Symphony. And I think I'll just let you hear a minute of that, and then we'll go on and see what your own imagery is. So here's the Brahms First Symphony. Half of the respondents in both cultures had images of mountains and forests and joy and dance and little animals dancing around. One of the responses was even, a person said, "Oh, I see a children's musical and the stage backdrop is mountains and forests and the children are dressed like little animals and they're dancing around." So here we have an image of Alps and an image of Brahms. I deliberately did not read anything about these pieces before I collected the data because I didn't want my own head leaking imagery to other people's. So I was quite astonished when I read that some, not all, but some musicologists think the First Symphony of Brahms was his response to seeing the Alps for the first time. Now the next piece is a Chinese piece, and here I'm going to show you the instrument on which it's played. It's called the qin, CH''IN, or in the new romanization, QIN. And I'm just going to let you hear about 1 minute and 40 seconds of this piece, and you can, again, see what your own imagery is. Everyone in both cultures, somewhere during their imagery, during this piece of music, had a numinous image of someone who represented or was a wise old man, kind of the person who plays this instrument and holds the values for the culture no matter what upheavals may be going on. Again, as I said, I didn't read before I selected the music. Confucius is thought to have played this instrument, and the title of it is Three Variations on Plum Blossom. Plum blossom, of course, being the flower that blooms through the snow and endures through the hardship of winter. So responses to music are subjective, but with universal underpinnings. We respond to any music through a unique set of psychological and physiological responses that are both triggered by and somehow embedded literally in the music, in the sounds of the music. Maybe that's why part of why music has been associated with healing for as long as we know, in myths, religions, and stories from all over the world. If you think of music as tones, it must have been one of the very earliest languages of humanity, because tones account for about 99% of the meaning of what we're hearing. So music really is a parallel language, conveying anything from the pre-verbal to beyond whatever could be articulated by words. It can reach deep inside us, beyond the barrier that spoken language can be, under the defenses, and touch what's real and authentic and genuine. It has power both personally and collectively. Now, moving to my clinical work with music, it's a method developed by Helen Bonney, and here's some photographs of Helen Bonney on the screen. Helen was a registered music therapist first, and then became a psychologist. In the early 70s, she was working at the Maryland Psychiatric Institute, where psychiatrists were experimenting with the effects of LSD on their patients. Helen's job as music therapist was to design the music induction to the LSD experience. And in so doing, she discovered you really didn't need the LSD to prompt an inner experience. The music alone had that capacity. In the music therapy profession, as far as I know right now, the Bonney method is one of only 5 or 6 methods officially recognized and used worldwide. And it's the method used in gathering my dissertation. I was fortunate to know Helen toward the end of her life and to even consult with her before I did the dissertation, which was very helpful. In the process, you help the patient with a physical relaxation. It may be through an induction to relax the body, then to focus on the inner world, and then the therapist introduces music to try to match the affective themes in the patient. They speak aloud, whatever their imagery is or their affect, whether it's tears or laughter or whatever. The therapist writes it down so there's a record of it. Sometimes the patient chooses to draw a picture afterwards. Usually it's something that's been very important in the imagery and may amplify actually what was going on. This is a working method of using music. It is not simply relaxation, although that may happen. We use in this method classical music because, 2 reasons, for its known form and function, with its known form and structure, classical music provides a safe container within the therapeutic container. And also, we use classical music because of the dynamic interaction of the 4 elements of music in it: rhythm, melody, harmony, and timbre. Classical music is dynamic and it's complicated, as the psyche is dynamic and complicated. As in other forms of active imagination, the ego is relaxed enough to allow the unconscious to come forward and speak whatever needs to be spoken that day. Music and therapists become almost co-therapists who contain, support, witness, mirror, facilitate, and act as tethers, allowing the patient or traveler to have any of several kinds of experience. And I've seen them all. It can be totally kinesthetic. It can be regressive. It can deal with current clinical situations like anger, grief, depression, so on. And it can be a form of active imagination, kind of allowing a story to come forth from the inner world, come to awareness, a bit like a waking dream. It can be deeply symbolic, and it may be quite spiritual. And we never can predict what's going to emerge, and often provides entree to material that we just wouldn't have gotten any other way. In fact, I've known it to connect people with the inner world for the first time ever. The caveat, of course, that it's a double-edged sword. If any medicine works, it's also dangerous, and I've seen this happen, not in my own practice, thank goodness. But if it's done naively or without adequate grounding, the patient could get overcome by the unconscious or identify with the unconscious, become inflated rather than understanding whatever has happened in the session symbolically or however it really needs to be understood. There's a developing body of quantitative and qualitative research that's validating our clinical experience with this method of working with music. The psyche links the visual and acoustic. As Jung once said in a letter, music expresses in sounds what fantasies and visions express in visual images. So I want to give you just a few examples from my own practice. One of them is from a medical hospital setting, because I used to work in hospitals for many years. But this first one is from my practice. A middle-aged woman has, as a child, suffered a significant abuse by her mother and later her brother. With authority figures, she often enacted the abused child, sometimes constellating the abuser in the authority figure through projective identification. In the solid holding structure of classical music in the context of the transference over time, she was able to safely enough re-experience the trauma. I'm happy to say she's been able to move on and hold her way, her own authority in some significant ways, like changing the structure for dissertation committee, getting a job in a well-known university, and being granted tenure. This is from my hospital experience. There was a driven type A woman with spinal fractures, and she had markedly affective experiences with gentle, nurturing music. Her nurses told me that after our music session, her pain and her need for pain meds was reduced for the next 24 hours. And I had a similar experience when I used music with sickle cell patients who were in a lot of pain. Another example, a successful middle-aged professional woman in traditional therapy requested a music session because she felt blocked in all areas, even in her therapy. Quite unexpectedly, in the one session we had, a childhood memory surfaced, which was the missing link that helped her understand where her real mothering had come from, a grandparent. And in the session, she was finally able to mourn that grandparent and the significance of that grandparent. It was a really important breakthrough for her that resolved the other blockages. I would see her professionally from time to time, and she would comment on how it had really helped. And the final example is brief work that led to analysis. Jenny was 48 and had had a mastectomy. She was profoundly frightened by the diagnosis of cancer and wanted to do something for herself, so she requested music sessions. Her major mode of defense was intellectualization. She came because she trusted the music first, and then she trusted me, and often the transference is first made to the music and only later to the therapist, because the music is already known and trusted. She was a clergy wife, mainline Protestant, but burned out with the church. We worked somewhat sporadically for about 18 months because she lived some distance away and getting to my office was a problem. There were a number of early childhood and current personal issues she could have worked on, but I think the most significant single event in our work was the constellation of the feminine. During an early music session, in her imagery, she was in a church with stone walls, kind of like the stone walls here, but there were religious figures carved into all the stone walls. And as she stood there in her image, one of the figures came out of the stone wall and approached her, and they began to dance together. And this was the music that was going on. It's called La Calinda. We'll hear about a minute of this. This was an incredibly intense experience for her and very moving for me as well. She realized she was dancing with the Virgin Mary, not a figure she'd ever really thought much about. The Virgin Mary was not emphasized in her church. She really hadn't thought much about her. This was the beginning of awakening of the feminine in Jenny, and began to form a bridge between the traditional church and her own emerging connection with her unconscious and her own emerging spiritual development. Eventually, when a recurrence of the cancer made travel more difficult, she requested a referral for a regular analysis in a community near hers. But the work with music, the imagery of the feminine, sustained her through the rest of her life. As she was dying, she felt in the next bed in the hospital room, she felt there was a helpful feminine presence there. And in one of her final radiation therapy sessions, she felt a mother bear licking her breast wound. I now want, for the final segment, to move to music and healing on a cultural level. My own experience often informs a talk, obviously, and this is no exception. I want to spend this time now talking about a piece of music commissioned and written expressly for the purpose of reconciliation and healing. It's called To Be Certain of the Dawn, and I think we have an image of that for the screen. It's by a man named Stephen Paulus, who lived in Minneapolis and just died in 2014. Stephen Paulus is known for his choral and operatic music. The libretto is by the poet Michael Dennis Brown. This is a major oratorio sung in Hebrew, German, and English, and scored for cantor, 4 soloists, adult chorus, children's chorus, shofar, which is a ram's horn, and full orchestra. When I heard a bit about this piece, I jumped at the chance to sing it when I did so with Berkshire Choral International in 2016. You need to know some background about this piece. So we're going to be showing you 2 images, St. Mary's Basilica in Minneapolis and Temple Israel in Minneapolis. These 2 churches have the history of collaboration up to and including a joint trip of parishioners of both congregations to Auschwitz and Birkenau. Here's an image of Auschwitz in case you need to see that again. The experience of that trip made Father O'Donnell of the Basilica realize that although Christianity was not responsible for the Holocaust or the Shoah, the Roman Catholic Church really had not helped by 2,000 years of blaming the Jews for the crucifixion of Jesus. So under his leadership, Father O'Donnell's, the Basilica commissioned this piece of music in honor of the temple, in honor of the anniversary of the liberation of the death camps, and of the Vatican Declaration of 1965, Nostra Aetate. And here's an image of that, which means in our time. This document not only declares the Jews not responsible for the crucifixion, but calls for Christian and Jews and all non-Christian religions to work together. It also calls specifically for Christianity and Islam to work together, and for an end to all intolerance for any reason. It's a big order. The commission for the music was made in the hope that a powerfully compelling piece of music might help children and others of this century realize what history and misguided Christianity had done, in the hope that it would not happen again. The poet and librettist Michael Dennis Brown was with us for the week of preparation of the piece, giving us insights into the 4 years of collaborative work that he had with Stephen Paulus, and could tell us things like, quote, "The children are the sun, moon, and stars of this piece. You can't tell the children there is no hope." And here's an image of children of Terezin concentration camp. Our conductor had worked with both Dennis Michael Brown and Stephen Paulus, so we really got it right from the source. The title is taken from a quote by Rabbi Abraham Heschel, which we'll show on your screen here. "This is the task, in the darkest night, to be certain of the dawn, certain of the power to turn a curse into a blessing and agony into a song." The work comes in 3 sections. The first is called Renewal, which is an agonizing return, or teshuvah in Hebrew. A return to self-examination of all we Christians failed to do in the kingdom of the night, by which he means the Shoah or the Holocaust. The second section is Remembrances. These are musical meditations based on children of a vanished world. I'm going to show you some of the haunting photographs of Roman Vishniak, who took these pictures in Europe in the 1930s as World War II was approaching. And I've tried to include with them some of the text of the songs that comes from each picture. It also talks about the flame as a symbol of the sacred within. And here are a couple of images of the sacred flame, which becomes very important musically as well. Throughout this section, the children's chorus sings simple blessings, sings of simple blessings. We thank you for the sunlight, for apples, for our dreams, for our hearts. The final section is called Visions of a Better World, where we can walk together as we labor to repair this world. Now, also the piece all the way through is punctuated at intervals by, on the one hand, the darkness and extreme discord of the music. There are tone clusters. A tone cluster is when you put your whole forearm down on the piano. That's a tone cluster. Excruciating, difficult harmonies. And some of the words, the hideous words that were spoken then, that come from the Nuremberg laws. And here on your screen you see something of the Nuremberg laws, such as Jews may not be citizens, Jews may not meet in public places, Jews may not attend school, Jews may not keep animals, Jews may not ride bicycles, up to and including, I think, at least in the music, Jews may not imagine, Jews may not dream. And the pounding rhythm of wear this star, wear this star. And that's the dark side. On the other side, there's this absolutely beautiful chorale, which Paulus wrote, with the words that are the core of the work. Stephen Paulus learned about a Jewish temple in Berlin that was totally destroyed, the temple totally destroyed, the grounds totally destroyed, except for one standing tombstone left on the grounds. And on that tombstone was written the commandment, you should love your neighbor as yourself, in both Hebrew and German. The day we found out about that, I thought, oh man, I don't know if I can sing this or not. So this commandment is the core of the work, sung first by the cantor in Hebrew, later by the chorus in German with the cantor in Hebrew and the music holding them sensitively together, and at the end by the cantor and chorus in Hebrew. It also, quite appropriately, for holding these opposites, becomes the music that Paulus writes to him, to the eternal flame, the eternal one, or the eternal wholeness within. I have an image here of both Hebrew and German of you should love your neighbor as yourself. As you might imagine, it's very difficult to sing technically and certainly emotionally, as you can see. The work begins with the playing of the shofar, and here is an image of 2 shofars. The ram's horn, traditional in the Jewish religion, and the cantor singing Shema Israel, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. Though I own a shofar, somebody brought it to me from Israel, I really hadn't heard it played professionally. And for me, it resonated at an absolutely visceral level. And reminded me that I've heard that our own analyst, Renee Brand, who got out of Germany just in time, thought that those of us who grew up with the background of the Christian religion really need to access our Jewish roots somehow. So here's the opening with the ram's horn in between shocking hammer strokes of discord in the orchestra, the cantor singing Shema Israel. I want to comment on the use of the tritone, which is a musical term. It means an augmented fourth. It's called diabolus in music, or the satanic in music, because it's very hard to sing. It demands resolution. You know it, though you don't know you know it, because it's what Leonard Bernstein uses in Maria. Maria. It gets resolved on the ah, but ba-dum, ba-dum. Very hard to sing. And it opens and closes the piece and occurs all the way through it. We're really not resolved yet, is what I think this tritone is suggesting. So I want to conclude with the opening of To Be Certain in the Dawn, followed by a driving, intense chorus. This we ask of you, you who brought us into being. Which tasks are ours, which labors, which joys, which dances? And finally, that left on a question mark, which instruments of yours do we become? And then there's this amazing transition into the chorale. And the answer, of course, to that question is you should love your neighbor as yourself.